In a few videos, I've mentioned that on the Appalachian Trail and anywhere else I'm backpacking, my choice for a sleeping pad is a closed cell pad about 1/4 of an inch thick. No doubt a few viewers have asked themselves, what is this guy, some kind of a freak? Well, we'll get to that in about a minute. The alternative to closed cell pads, of course, are inflatable sleeping pads. And I would imagine it's obvious why inflatable pads are appealing, because most of them look so comfortable. And we don't have to watch many YouTube videos to learn inflatable pads are popular among long-distance hikers. One might imagine that in the year 2023, after years of development in inflatable sleeping pads, that they are perfectly reliable and there's no danger that one will go flat on us. But is that true? What if one does go flat on us? What if it takes 10 minutes to go flat and we can't find the leak? What if we don't know what's wrong with it except it doesn't work? If we're on an overnight trip or if we're car camping, it might not be that big of a deal. We might be uncomfortable for only one night. We might be able to quickly buy a replacement. A flat sleeping pad can be a bigger problem if we're out for days at a time on a long trail trying to cover 30, 50, or 100 miles. At some spots on the Appalachian Trail, for example, we wouldn't have the chance to buy a new sleeping pad until we hiked another 3 days or so, if not more. And that brings us to the basic topic of this video. Under that bad news scenario, is there anything we can do to be a little less miserable until we can get a new pad? And how about that reliability question? Is there really a chance that a $200 sleeping pad that could weigh up to 16 ounces might not hold air overnight? To answer that question, I did a search on the whiteblaze.net website, which focuses mainly on the Appalachian Trail. For at least 20 years that I know of, this website has had a message board that's included more hikers than I can count. I know a lot of online forums about other topics have a bad reputation. For example, some forums include people looking for an argument, or people who clearly don't know what they're talking about, or people eager to troll someone else, etc. I do not see that on White Blaze. I can tell if a hiker has a lot of experience by reading what they have to say, and a ton of experienced people are on White Blaze. It's true, some folks there will say they've used the same inflatable pad for years with no problem. Not everyone on White Blaze will tell us that. I found that in recent years, right up to 2023, hikers have been saying inflatable pads can and do fail. Here's what I read about on White Blaze. Interior panels separate or delaminate, and one part of the pad swells up like a balloon, flattening the rest of the pad. One hiker said this has happened to him with no less than 10 pads. If a pad is stored for a long period, deflated and packed into a stuff sack, it can develop tears when it's inflated again. This has happened to me twice with inflatable pads that I used on overnight trips close to home. I kept them tightly packed into their stuff sacks, and much later, when I inflated them, each one had long tears or splits that leaked air fast. Here we see one I patched with duct tape in an attempt to keep air inside it. It didn't work. The answer to this is to keep the pad inflated at all times, even in our closet at home. I learned this the hard way, and I also read this recommendation on White Blaze. Pads can develop multiple holes, and repair kits sold by manufacturers might not work. One hiker wrote that he put 80, that's 80, patches on one pad in a failed attempt to save it. Cactus thorns can puncture a pad. If we have never been to a desert, we might assume cactus thorns stay on the cactus. They do not. If there's a lot of cactus, spines are practically everywhere, especially small, thin ones we might not spot. The last time I was in a desert, a very thin thorn went right through the sole of one of my Crocs. If they can do that, they can go through a closed cell pad or puncture an inflatable pad. Some hikers also complain that some inflatable pads are slippery and slide around on a tent floor. Other hikers say some pads make them feel like they're falling off the thing. On top of all this, some hikers complain that some inflatable pads are very noisy. This can be an issue if 4 or 5 people are using one in an AT shelter. People also snore, and in some spots on the AT, insects make a lot of racket at night. My advice is carry earplugs. On White Blaze, I found more than one person who said inflatable pads are for comfort and not for safety. Their point is that if we are out for days at a time in winter, our sleeping pad absolutely must perform. It must insulate us from both the cold ground and any snow that might be under us. Several hikers wrote that they take this issue so seriously they carry not one but two sleeping pads, one as a spare in case their main pad won't stay inflated. Some people carry a closed cell pad for that spare, and others carry two inflatable pads. If we're out in cold and snowy conditions on foot for days at a time, I call that a smart idea. It can be argued, I suppose, that if manufacturers sold quality products, reliability wouldn't be an issue. On the other hand, I am inclined to say that if companies could manufacture inflatable pads that are 100% reliable, and those pads are light enough and cheap enough to be marketed, they would have been making them 10 or 15 years ago. In other words, I'm not sure the technology exists to produce an inflatable pad that will never fail no matter what and still meet those requirements. For that reason, I endorse the recommendation to keep an inflatable pad inflated in storage. It also makes sense, if the pad isn't too dirty, to throw it on the bed and sleep on it before a backpacking trip to make sure it's still functional. And this brings us back to my 1/4 inch closed cell pad. This, of course, is not that pad. This is my homemade pyramid tent. I talked about this thing repeatedly, and not once have I ever said, hey, you just got to make one of these things. No. Instead, I have said more than once that I know virtually nobody is going to make their own tent. I talked about this tent because it's what I use, and I made it for some very specific reasons. And even if nobody else makes one, those reasons are worth talking about. The same applies to my 1/4 inch pad. I've never said other people should use such a thing, and I know very, very few people would even consider it. Even if somebody wanted to use a pad like this, I think they're out of luck. This was sold by Coleman, and all evidence suggests Coleman quit selling them. I paid about $10 for one. I used to see them in Walmarts and souvenir shops at national parks. I have two of them. One of them I cut down to 3/4 length, and it weighs 6 ounces. I understand that if somebody absolutely has to have something soft and bouncy to sleep on, a flat inflatable pad is going to make them very unhappy. Even so, sleeping on flat ground will be easier to deal with than sleeping on rocks and tree roots. When my inflatable pad went flat on me, I laid down on the thing and still had a normal night's sleep. That happened because I have a long-standing habit of giving a close look at a spot before I decide to sleep on it. This is a skill I developed over time. In my early days, I used to lay my pad on the ground and lie on it to make sure the spot was flat enough. I did this before pitching the tent. If there's vegetation on the ground, a spot that looks flat enough sometimes will have rocks or roots at the surface that aren't easily seen. Based on that experience, I later figured out how to test a spot by just walking back and forth over it. If I find a spot big enough and flat enough to sleep on, that's good enough for me. If a spot has a slight incline, I've been able to use it by placing my head at the higher end. When it comes to picking a tent site, we should also look at the trees nearby and the tree limbs overhead. A nearby dead tree or large dead limbs overhead might come falling down even with no wind blowing. On some hillsides, water will run downhill in sheets during a heavy rain. This can happen at a couple of AT shelters I've seen. This usually can be avoided if we pick a tent spot that's higher than and flatter than the surrounding ground. Once or twice at spots with very little vegetation, I've been able to improve a sleeping spot with a small trowel. During a typical day on the AT, I'm climbing and walking all day, and by nightfall I'm tired. And when I'm tired, I'm going to fall asleep, and nothing is going to stop me. One night in the summer, I got to an AT shelter at 8 p.m., and laid down on the bare wooden floor wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I fell asleep immediately and didn't wake up until it was cold and dark 2 hours later. During my misspent youth, I learned to fall asleep on the floors and other places too embarrassing to admit to. I can sleep on my back or stomach practically anywhere, and on my side if I got something to rest my head on. I make these confessions because it helps to explain why I have no problem with a closed cell pad a quarter-inch thick. One obvious advantage of a closed cell pad is its 100% reliability. It's not inflatable and will never go flat. My flimsy pad is both cheap and light and can be deployed by just tossing it on the ground. This photo shows my blue Coleman pad when it was brand new. The pad on the left is 3/8 of an inch thick, and I used it on a lot of hunting trips. On the right are two of the original Ridge Rests pads. Both are a 1/2 inch thick. One is full length and the other is 3/4 or torso length. These days, they are sold and called Ridge Rest Classic. When it comes to sleeping on snow in the winter, there's a thing called R value, which measures insulating properties. The Appalachian Mountain Club website says a sleeping pad R value of 2 is adequate for spring, summer, and fall, but in winter, an R value of 5 is needed. So if somebody asks me if an R value of 5 is needed on snow, I'll say yes. If we have no experience sleeping on snow, better safe than sorry. What I do recommend is that we never go out on our first winter trip on foot in any wilderness area without first trying winter camping close to home. Every state I know of has state parks with campgrounds. At these places, we can park our vehicle close to our tent site. We can bail out and go home if we find our gear can't meet the challenge of snow and frozen ground. If we absolutely have to be out on a long trail in winter with an inflatable pad, I vote to imitate those White Blaze hikers and carry a closed cell pad for backup. When my inflatable pad died on me, I slept on it anyway, even flat. These things have some bulk to them, and they're still better than nothing. There's also the idea of cutting nice, fluffy branches to sleep on. But fluffy branches require pine or other evergreen trees in abundance and in tons of places, particularly in the American East and Midwest, none will be found. Gathering up dead leaves is another sketchy idea, because dead leaves are in short supply in a number of places, and in anything but perfect weather, dead leaves are likely to be wet. It's better to be prepared in the first place. One last tip is to always carry our sleeping bag inside a plastic garbage bag, even in winter. If a water bottle leaks into our pack in the winter, a wet sleeping bag would be very, very bad news. So once again, we are done. For those who don't know, I've assembled a number of playlists that can be found on my channel page. These deal with topics including sleeping, gear, endurance, and so forth. They're a handy way to hear just about everything I have to say on any particular topic. And as always, thanks a million for watching.